The morning the truth came back to life was the morning a CEO walked into a small repair shop in Merrow Creek, Ohio, and tried to bury it again. Holden Barrett, a black mechanic of 41 in a frayed denim shirt, stood beside the rusted carcass of a forgotten prototype, its pipes, wires, and cracked control panel exposed. Sierra Calloway, the cream-suited CEO of Asterion Motors, pointed at the machine and said, loud enough for the two workers outside to hear, "It died 15 years ago. It will never run again." Holden said nothing. Faded letters on the chassis still read Asterion RX-1. 3 weeks earlier, the morning had carried a different weight. A liquidation auction was being held at a decommissioned testing facility on the outskirts of Columbus, the kind of place where wet concrete and old oil had soaked into the walls so deep no one bothered painting over them anymore. Holden Barrett parked his Ford F-250 at the far edge of the gravel lot and walked in late. The crowd inside was thin and weathered, scrap dealers with calloused hands, small shop mechanics looking for bargain parts, a few collectors who traded in antique machinery the way other people traded baseball cards. No one important, no one who remembered. Holden moved past them without speaking, his work boots crunching against gravel that had been turning to dust for 30 years. He found it in the back corner of the largest warehouse, covered with a gray tarp that had stiffened into its own shape from years of dust. When he pulled the edge back, the thing under it stopped him mid-motion. The body panels had been stripped almost to the bones. The control board was scorched along one side. The battery housings were empty, a human silhouette of a vehicle, reduced to structure and intention. But Holden recognized the dual-loop cooling brackets along the undercarriage. He recognized the secondary chamber housing along the spine. He recognized the concave curve at the rear where the turbine assist module was meant to sit. He had seen those curves once before in a drawing late at night, in a break room that smelled like burnt coffee. He had been 28 years old then. The auctioneer introduced it without ceremony as industrial scrap, probable non-operational, bid to start at $500. A man with silver hair leaned toward his friend near the front of the room and said, "Just loud enough to carry. Look at that boy. Thinks he's buying a Ferrari." The crowd laughed. Holden did not turn his head. He raised his hand at 900. No one followed. The room gave a collective half-laugh, the sound people make when they have decided someone is entertaining. It was while Holden was signing the purchase form that Sierra Calloway walked in through the side entrance, with 4 people at her back, 2 lawyers, a communications officer, and a man in a dark coat who didn't look like either. Sierra was the CEO of Asterion Motors, 39 years old, with the kind of composed face that gave nothing away and the kind of posture that gave everything away. When her eyes found Holden at the desk, and then found the vehicle he had just purchased, something moved across her expression, a flicker, fast and involuntary, before it went flat again. She approached and asked, with a voice that was not quite a question, whether he understood what he had acquired. Holden looked up from the form, something they never let finish its sentence. Sierra let out a measured exhale. Then she turned slightly, raising her voice to a pitch the room could hear. "That prototype didn't fail because we ran out of good engineers. It failed because it couldn't run. No one is going to bring it back to life." The room laughed again, softer this time. Holden finished signing, pocketed his copy, and walked out to get the tow cables. As he pulled out of the lot, he did not look back. But if he had, he would have seen Sierra still standing in the warehouse entrance, watching the truck disappear with an expression that had nothing to do with contempt. It looked like the face of someone who had just watched something they buried begin to move. Holden hauled the machine home to Merrow Creek through a light rain. The town sat at the intersection of 2 state highways in a fold of landscape that was mostly corn and sky, and Barrett Mechanical Repair occupied a low building at the edge of it, set back from the road behind a gravel lot. A painted metal sign faded to a suggestion of itself, and the deep, biographical smell of engine oil that never fully leaves a space once it has moved in. Maddie was waiting at the shop door when he pulled up. She was 14, her curly hair pulled into a high ponytail, her eyes the same dark brown her mother had carried into and out of the world. She watched him unload, hands in the pockets of her hoodie, water dripping off the gutter behind her. "Daddy." "Did we just spend the rent on this?" she asked softly. Holden set the toolbox down on the concrete and rested his hand on her shoulder for a moment. Sometimes a thing being left behind doesn't mean it has nothing left to say. Maddie considered that the way she considered most things, with patience that did not belong to her age, and went inside to start the rice cooker. What she did not know, what no one in Merrow Creek knew, except Holden himself, was that 15 years earlier, he had worked at Asterion Motors, not as a lead engineer, not as anyone whose name had appeared on patent applications. He had been a systems integration engineer, 26 years old at hire, one of 3 black men on the technical floor, and the only one in his sub-team. 2 weeks before the so-called testing accident of the RX-1 prototype, he had filed a written safety flag in the project log. He had walked it through the proper channels. It had been acknowledged. It had been filed. It had been ignored. When the project collapsed 3 weeks after that, an internal review went out. His name appeared in the failure file, not prominently, not in bold, but clearly enough that, in the years that followed, anyone who scrolled the document long enough would land on it and decide they had found their answer. His wife had left 2 years later, not dramatically, in the slow, exhausted way of someone who had decided that a life built on unresolved grievance was not what she had signed up for. He had not blamed her. He had raised Maddie. He had run the shop. He had stopped looking at anything with the Asterion name on it. That afternoon, Travis Nolan walked over from the parts store 2 blocks down. Travis was 62, white, the only friend Holden trusted in town. He brought 2 paper cups of coffee, set one on the workbench, and stood looking at the machine. "Holden," he said, after a long minute, "strip it. Sell the metal. You don't owe these people anything." Holden took the coffee and didn't answer. Travis left, shaking his head the way an older brother might. After dinner that night, after Maddie had gone to bed, Holden sat alone with the machine. He pulled the tarp off completely. He ran his hands along the stripped chassis, feeling for stress, for cuts, for memory. The Asterion logo on the side panel had oxidized into a ghost of itself. He said quietly, "To no one. They called you a failure. But I know they never let you finish your sentence." He began cataloging. An hour in, while photographing the inside of the port bay cover, he froze. A small adhesive label, yellowed but legible, was stuck to the inside of the data port shield. It read, RX-1 Unit 03. Final trial not completed. Holden sat back on the concrete floor. This was not the machine that had failed. This was the machine that had never been allowed to try. Asterion Motors occupied 12 floors of glass in Chicago's West Loop, the kind of building that declared its own importance through transparency, the kind of place where executives could see the city working below them and pretend that was the same as understanding it. On the morning after the auction, a junior associate stepped into Sierra Calloway's office with a tablet held against her chest. She told Sierra the buyer of the RX-1 had been identified. A former employee, a man named Holden Barrett, who had been part of the original integration team. Sierra was quiet for 5 seconds. Then she said, "The black engineer from the integration team?" The associate nodded. Sierra did not respond immediately. She turned back to the window and watched the elevated train run between buildings. Her face stayed flat. Her hand, however, closed slowly around the rim of her coffee cup until the porcelain pressed white into her palm. 2 days later, the executive board met on the 11th floor in a conference room with frosted glass. Vaughn Mercer, 64, Chief Financial Officer, the man who had pushed through the $480 million lithium partnership in 2006, did not bother to hide his irritation as he spoke. "You let it go to public auction. And of all people, to him?" He said the word him, the way some men said certain words, with weight it did not need to carry, with the particular emphasis that turned a pronoun into a category. Sierra met his look without blinking. "The unit is non-operational. It's missing the cold start sequence. Only one person ever had the complete code, and that person hasn't worked in this industry in 15 years. Mercer studied her face for a long moment. Then he said quietly, "It doesn't matter whether it runs. What matters is that it not be seen." The room registered the sentence. The communications officer wrote nothing down. The legal director adjusted his collar. Sierra felt the shape of what had just been said and understood, perhaps for the first time, that whatever she had once been part of had grown into something she no longer controlled. That same night, in Merrow Creek, Maddie carried a covered plate of leftover chicken and rice into the garage and set it on the corner of the workbench nearest where her father was working. She did not say anything. Holden looked up from inside the control bay, saw her, nodded once. She lingered for a beat. "Daddy," she said softly, the way she said things that had been sitting in her since school. "Why did they laugh at you in that video?" Holden set down the screwdriver. He came out from under the dash and sat on the wheeled stool. A clip from the auction, 18 seconds long, was circulating on regional tech forums. A black man at a junkyard buying something a CEO had said couldn't be saved. The captions were the captions you would expect, he thought before he spoke. Because they think a man who looks like me can't fix what people in suits couldn't. Maddie didn't cry. She just stood there for a moment with a tea towel in her hand. Then she said, "Eat your dinner before it gets cold," and went back into the house. Holden ate. Slowly. He did not taste much. That same Thursday evening, in Cincinnati, a freelance technology journalist named Whitney Boone was scrolling a forum on her couch, with her laptop balanced on her knees, when the 18-second clip surfaced again. She recognized the RX-1 designation. She had tried to research it twice in her career. Both times, she had hit the same wall, a smooth, clean absence of information where information should have been, the kind of absence that meant someone had been paid to make it. She closed her laptop. She got in her car. She drove to Merrow Creek. Whitney Boone was 34, sharp-featured, the kind of journalist who had learned early that the most important stories were not announced. She had won regional awards for digging through municipal contract fraud and freight rerouting scandals. She arrived at Barrett Mechanical Repair on a cold Wednesday morning and was turned away within 30 seconds. She came back the next day. Holden told her, more politely the second time, that he wasn't interested in becoming someone's story. She came back a third time with a name, Gideon Hart, she said, standing in the gravel lot with her notebook tucked under her arm, senior engineer on the original RX-1 development team. In 2011, he sent an email to an automotive trade publication stating that the project's termination did not follow standard review protocol. The publication didn't run it, but the email exists. Holden was quiet. Then, in a way that was different from his usual quiet, a different gravity. "Where does he live?" he asked. "Dayton," Whitney said. He drove there the following morning. Gideon Hart lived in a 2-bedroom house on the outskirts of Dayton that looked, from the outside, like a man had moved in and immediately stopped caring about the outside. Inside was a different story. Labeled archive boxes, drafting tables with yellowed graph paper still pinned down, a wall of technical manuals organized by era, and the quiet, complex smell of a space that had been used for serious thinking for a long time. Gideon was 71, white-haired, soft-spoken, in the way of a man who had spent decades ensuring every measurement was exactly correct. He opened the door, looked at Holden without recognition, and started to close it again. "Unit 03, Holden said. Something organized itself behind Gideon's eyes. He opened the door wider. He made coffee. He sat down across from Holden in a kitchen that hadn't been redecorated since 1996, and asked, before anything else, "Son, do you really understand what you're reaching for? It's not just the machine that wakes up. The people who buried it wake up too." Holden said he was prepared for that. Gideon set his mug down and spoke. The Asterion RX-1 had never been only an electric vehicle. The project had been built around a micro-turbine regenerative hybrid drive, a miniaturized gas turbine that did not directly power the wheels, but continuously recharged a compressed energy buffer, creating a recovery cycle that extended range far beyond what contemporary battery technology allowed. Early simulations had suggested efficiency ratios the industry would not reach for more than a decade. The problem had not been engineering. The problem had been timing. In 2006, The Asterion board had committed to a $480 million partnership with a battery cell manufacturer predicated on large-format lithium packs as the future of electric propulsion. If the RX-1 system succeeded in public testing, it would call that entire investment into question. It would expose the board's strategic pivot as a financial decision rather than an engineering one. 3 units had been built. Unit 01 had experienced a thermal event during early testing and was destroyed. Unit 02 had been disassembled for analysis. Unit 03, the machine in Holden's shop, had never completed a full trial. It had been ready. The test date had been set. Then, 12 minutes before the sequence was scheduled to begin, a hold order had come down from the executive level. The signature on the hold order was Sierra Calloway, at the time Vice President of Strategic Development. 12 minutes. 15 years. Gideon reached under the drafting table and pulled out a cardboard mailing tube. Inside were several sheets of technical paper, the dual-loop cooling schematic, the secondary control core layout, drawn in the precise hand of someone who had memorized every line before committing it to paper. He pressed the tube into Holden's hands. And son, listen carefully. When the project collapsed, they needed a name in the failure file. They picked yours. Not because you made the mistake, because picking yours was easy. A young black engineer no one would defend. Don't restore this thing like a car. Restore it like testimony. Holden drove back to Merrow Creek with the cardboard tube on the passenger seat and the words still arranging themselves in his head. By the time he reached the shop, it was past 11. He spread the drawings across the rear wall of the garage, taped them flat, stood back to look at them for a long time, and then began. The work was not a montage. It was weeks of slow, hard, frequently discouraging labor in a cold building with inadequate equipment and a budget that required constant improvisation. He ran the shop during the day. Oil changes, brake jobs, alignments, and worked the RX-1 from the time the last customer left until his hands stopped being reliable. He sourced a recycled industrial cooling pump from a decommissioned food processing plant 40 miles outside town. He wound coils from copper stripped out of a retired generator. He machined custom brackets on a CNC unit old enough to have a manual written in a font no longer in use. Twice a week, Travis Nolan dropped off parts at cost, no questions asked, and stood for a moment, looking at the machine before driving back to his store. On the 11th day of the rebuild, he confirmed what he had suspected since the second night. The primary wiring harness had been cut. Not frayed, not corroded. Cut, cleanly, at 3 separate junctions, in locations that would only be meaningful to someone who understood the system's internal logic. Someone had made the machine look like it had failed. Someone had made it perform its own death. A regional television station ran a short piece around week 4. The Chiron said, "Single dad spends last savings on impossible prototype." The package framed Holden as a sympathetic curiosity, the kind of story a station ran between weather and high school football. A former Asterion operations manager appeared on camera to explain, with practiced sympathy, that if Asterion's full engineering division had been unable to make the RX-1 viable, no small-town mechanic was going to change that. He paused before small-town, and the pause held a word he hadn't said. Sierra was asked about the situation at a technology panel in Detroit. 2 days later, she gave the camera a practiced smile. "Engineering does not run on hope," she said. "The RX-1 will never move under its own power again." The clip became a headline. Holden's name was now publicly attached to a prediction of failure. That evening, Maddie sat at the small folding table in the corner of the shop, working through algebra homework while her father bent over the engine bay. She did not look up. She kept her pencil moving. "Daddy," she said, after a long pause. "A girl at school today told me her dad says, 'You're embarrassing yourself.'" Holden set down the wrench. He came around the front of the machine, pulled the second folding chair over, and sat down next to his daughter at the small table. He did not look at her first. He looked at the algebra problem. "What's this one asking?" She showed him. He explained the substitution. She wrote it out. He waited until she had finished it before he answered. "Sweetheart," he said, very quietly, Sometimes people need you to fail so the story they've been telling themselves still makes sense. That doesn't make the story true. Maddie nodded. She did not look up from her notebook. She wrote the next problem. After a minute, she said, "Okay, that was all." She did not ask anything else. She finished her homework, packed her bag, kissed the top of his head on the way out of the shop, and went to bed. Holden sat there for a long time after she left. Then he stood up, walked back to the machine, picked up the wrench, and went back to work. He did not stop until 2 in the morning. Whitney came back to the shop the morning after Sierra's Detroit interview ran. She did not bring a camera. She brought a thermos of coffee and an idea. "Holden," she said, leaning against the doorframe, "if they get to frame you as delusional, you should at least have the right to show people what you're actually doing." He thought about it for a full minute. He had not wanted to turn the machine into entertainment. But Sierra had said his name on national television and used the word hope the way you used the word delusion. If the only people speaking were the ones with podiums, then the only thing the world would hear was the podium. He nodded once. Limited access. No internal components on camera. No proprietary detail. You document the man, not the machine. "Deal," Whitney said. 3 days later, on a clear Tuesday morning, a woman in a charcoal coat drove a sedan that was too clean for the gravel lot into the driveway of Barrett Mechanical Repair. She introduced herself as Mallory Quinn, corporate legal counsel for Asterion Motors. Her shoes were the kind that did not understand mud. She explained that activation of any embedded proprietary software would constitute unauthorized use of Asterion intellectual property. She then placed a single-page offer on the workbench, $25,000 for immediate transfer of the unit, standard non-disclosure agreement attached. $25,000 was not a small number for a man 3 months behind on his equipment financing. Holden picked up the page. He read it slowly. Then he set it back down and asked one question. "Why is something you called non-operational worth $25,000 to people who threw it away for $900? Mallory did not answer. She had not been authorized to. She left. The pressure became specific within 10 days. The bank called about his equipment loan. A commercial repair contract he had been counting on for the winter was canceled without explanation. His primary parts supplier informed him they were moving to a prepayment-only policy for his account. Whitney traced the chain in a single afternoon. A holding company with documented ties to a fund managed by Von Mercer had recently purchased a controlling stake in the supplier's parent company. The pressure was being applied from outside, slowly, without fingerprints. That Friday night, around 10, after the shop had closed and Holden was sitting alone at the workbench with the invoices stacked in front of him, and the RX-1 3 feet away and still unfinished, Maddie walked in carrying something he had not seen in years. She set his old, Asterion-era engineering notebook on the bench in front of him. The cover was scuffed at the corners. She had found it in a box in his closet months ago, and she had not said anything about it until now. "Daddy," she said, "I don't understand most of what's in here, but every time I see you look at that thing in the shop, you don't look like a man fixing a machine. You look like a man trying to find a version of himself somebody made him put down." She put one hand briefly on his shoulder. Then she said goodnight and went back into the house. Holden opened the notebook. He read the first page. He read his own handwriting at 26. He decided he was not selling. 3 nights later, at 1:40 in the morning, the pressure trigger alarm Holden had wired to the shop door himself, a simple system, nothing fancy but loud, went off. By the time he reached the garage, whoever had been inside was gone. The door lock had been bypassed cleanly. A data port module on the inside of the control bay had been removed. A small piece, but one that interfaced with the diagnostic memory banks. Holden reviewed the security camera footage. In the single clear frame where the figure turned near the rear wall, the chest logo on their jacket was visible. He recognized it from a vendor list 15 years old. It was no longer a restoration, it was a confrontation, and only one side had acknowledged it so far. Holden tried Dorian Blake's number 7 times across 2 weeks. 6 of them got nothing. Not even voicemail. The 7th, he left a message. His voice was tired but steady. "My name is Holden Barrett. I have Unit 03 in a shop in Ohio. It isn't dead, but I need the truth to wake it up. 3 days later, an unlisted number called back. Dorian was 61, Asian American, soft-spoken, living somewhere outside Bozeman, Montana. He had been the project's former software lead. He had been the only person to ever hold the complete cold start activation sequence. He spoke in the careful, abbreviated way of a man who had spent a long time choosing words for their defensive properties. The first thing he told Holden was to stop. Then he told him why he wouldn't. The final simulation run on Unit 03, Dorian said, returned efficiency metrics that exceeded every internal benchmark by a margin that made the company's existing technology roadmap look like it had been designed backward. The decision to cancel the physical test was made within hours of those simulation results reaching the executive level. The hold order was the kind of thing that doesn't get reversed, because the people who issued it understand exactly what it would mean to let it be. Holden asked why Dorian had said nothing for 15 years. The line was quiet for a long time. When Dorian spoke again, his voice was different. I signed a settlement under threat of a lawsuit that would have destroyed me. I had a family. I was afraid, but I didn't destroy the code. I couldn't. Everyone who worked on that system poured something real into it. You more than most. They told you the failure was your fault. They told you that because you were the easiest one to blame. I never forgave myself for not standing next to you when they did. Holden didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, I'd like to bring it back. Dorian asked, do you have the dual loop schematic? Yes. Do you have the secondary core layout? Yes. Walk me through the bring-up. I want to know if you can do it without destroying the turbine. For the next 40 minutes, they ran the system out loud. The reverse cooling cycle, the valve timing for the turbine ignition, the method for masking the auxiliary battery's automatic shutoff signal. During the initial ignition window, Holden answered every question without hesitation. He had memorized the schematic the way men memorize the address of a place they used to live. When he was done, Dorian was quiet again. Then he said, Gideon was right about you. You're the only one who still listens to what this machine is saying. Several days later, a physical storage drive arrived at Whitney's apartment in Cincinnati. On it was the complete cold start activation sequence, annotated, with edge conditions and failure states. There was also a separate data file Dorian had included with a single line of explanation. You'll need to understand what else you're turning on. The file described a passive archiving protocol embedded in the RX-1's core system at Gideon's insistence during final assembly. Internally, it had been labeled the Black Orchard Protocol. If the unit's original activation core was used to bring the system online, the protocol would automatically compile and transmit the complete archive test log, including all simulation data, all executive communications flagged to the project file, and a record of every command issued to the unit's operational status during its final active period. This was why Sierra had said second core to Mercer. The second core was not a spare part. It was a witness, and it was still sitting inside the machine in a small Ohio garage, waiting for someone to give it the right reason to speak. Night 47 was cold. The temperature had dropped into the mid-20s. Holden had been awake for 31 of the previous 36 hours. His hands were steady in the particular way. Hands get steady when they have run out of room to be nervous. Gideon Hart had driven up from Dayton that afternoon, moving slowly, but moving. He sat near the workbench, a cup of black coffee cooling in his hands, watching the man he had once trained. Whitney stood near the door with her camera lowered, recording only audio. Dorian was on a secure line, the speaker set low, his voice arriving from Montana as a periodic murmur of confirmation. Focused, quiet, carrying the weight of everything that depended on precision. At 1 in the morning, the door from the house opened. Maddie came in wearing an oversized hoodie, slippers, and a wool blanket draped over her shoulders. She did not say anything. She walked to the wooden stool in the corner, climbed onto it, pulled the blanket around her, and watched. Holden looked up. He almost told her to go back to bed. He stopped himself. He understood somehow that this was something she needed to witness, that this was the night she would carry quietly for the rest of her life. He nodded at her once. She nodded back. He returned to the machine. He pressurized the cooling loop and checked for leaks before committing any electrical current. He brought auxiliary power online at a fraction of its rated capacity. He walked the control board into maintenance mode, bypassing the corrupted startup defaults. He loaded the cold start sequence from the drive, verified the checksum, confirmed the injection timing. He disconnected the fail-safe relay that would have misread the turbine's early ignition cycle as a fault. He installed the Orchard module into the diagnostic port, and he began the thermal pre-cycle. The first attempt failed within seconds. The second saw the auxiliary battery voltage drop below threshold. On the third, the entire shop lost power for several seconds. Gideon said quietly, "Holden, maybe we should stop." Holden was already on his back beneath the control bay, running his fingers along the wiring harness with the slow attention of a man reading something written in his own hand. He found it within 2 minutes. A single lead, reversed at a junction block in the temperature monitoring circuit. Not corroded, not degraded. Reversed. Someone, at some point after the project had been canceled, had swapped 2 leads so that any cold start attempt would abort before the turbine reached operating condition, leaving no obvious trace of interference. He rewired the junction with a short spare lead. He reset the board. He ran the pre-cycle once more. At 2:16 in the morning, he initiated the full sequence. The first sound was a series of relays clicking in rapid succession. Then a sound from the turbine housing that had no clean analog. Something between a breath and a hum. A low, sustained tone with texture to it. The sound of metal parts that had not moved in 15 years beginning to find their geometry again. The instrument panel lit in a ripple of blue-white. The cracked screen at the center of the dash resolved from gray static to the old Asterion startup logo, and then to something newer. A clean status readout in small white text. Asterion RX-1, Unit 03. Final trial mode. Available. Holden sat back on his heels. He let out a long exhale that he had been holding in some form for 15 years. Maddie climbed off the stool. She walked across the cold concrete in her slippers. She stood beside her father and put one hand on his shoulder. She did not cry. She just looked at the blue light reflected in his eyes. From the phone on the bench, Dorian's voice came through after several seconds of silence. It remembers the way home. In a hotel room in Chicago, a monitoring application on Sierra Calloway's phone registered an activation signal from a legacy system identifier she had not seen in 15 years. She sat up straight in the dark. She called Von Mercer. She said 3 words. It came on. Asterion responded within 48 hours. A corporate statement called the RX-1, an unvalidated and potentially hazardous legacy prototype. Sierra appeared in a televised interview and said, with carefully constructed concern, "A machine that lights up is not a machine that runs." That sentence decided Holden's next step. He confirmed with a local attorney that operating the vehicle on privately owned land fell within his rights. He announced the test publicly with 72 hours of notice. An open invitation, Asterion Motors included, if they chose to attend. The night before the test, Sierra came to the shop alone. She walked in without knocking, hands in the pockets of her coat, and looked at the RX-1. She told him he didn't understand what success would mean. Stock value, supplier contracts, pensions. She told him he was holding all of that and treating it like a point of principle. Holden listened. Then he spoke. "Sierra, 15 years ago, when you needed a name for the failure file, you didn't pick the man who funded the bad decision. You picked the youngest black engineer in the room. That wasn't an accident." That was the easiest sentence for the world to believe. "I'm not burning down a company. I'm turning on a light in a room you locked a long time ago." Sierra didn't answer. She walked out. At the edge of the gravel lot, she stopped and looked back. Her face, for that brief moment, carried what she had not allowed herself to show in public in a very long time. Not contempt, not anger. The face of a woman who had finally heard, out loud, the sentence she had spent 15 years pretending was not a sentence. The morning of the test was cold. The Marrow Creek test circuit, a former agricultural assessment loop, behind a family-owned farm, was lined 4 and 5 deep along both sides. Technologists, mechanics, farmers in canvas jackets, journalists who had driven through the night, independent engineers who had seen the Night 47 video and wanted to look at the data themselves. At one end of the road, the Asterian delegation stood apart. Vaughn Mercer in a charcoal overcoat, 2 attorneys, Sierra Calloway, slightly separate, an independent engineer named Archer Hayes, sourced by Whitney through a national credentialing organization with no prior connection to either party, had inspected the vehicle the previous afternoon. When Mercer requested a halt on public safety grounds, Hayes produced his inspection record. There was no legal basis to stop. Holden got into the vehicle. He activated the drive sequence. The first lap was slow. Then the turbine reached its operational band. The sound changed. Clean. Deep. The vehicle accelerated. The second lap showed the regenerative system returning charge to the buffer at levels higher than the design baseline. On the third lap, Holden brought the speed into the original test parameters, held it through the long straight, and brought it back with a controlled deceleration that fed another charge return into the system. He came to a stop at the start line. The turbine wound down to idle. The crowd was silent for several seconds. Then the noise built from a dozen places at once. Not cheering. A collective release of suspended disbelief. Archer Hayes walked to the vehicle, looked at the external data logger and said, audibly enough for the first 3 rows, "If these numbers are real, this system is 10 years ahead of anything currently in production." The numbers were real. Then the Orchard module completed its final handshake. Whitney connected it to a portable projector. The image appeared large enough for the crowd to read. Unit 03 final simulation results. Baseline exceeded by 31%. Executive hold issued. Rationale. RX. One success presents unacceptable conflict with existing battery cell investment thesis. Authorization to cancel trial. Signed, Sierra Calloway. Financial impact assessment. Authorizing permanent suppression of project data. Signed, Vaughn Mercer. Below that, one more line. An internal email from a former human resources director recommending the name Barrett be attached to the failure file because of lower internal advocacy network. Corporate language for no one would fight for him. Cameras turned toward the Asterian delegation. Mercer was surrounded before he had taken 15 steps. Sierra did not move. She looked at the projected text without speaking. Holden stepped out of the RX-1, dirty from the engine bay work he had done at 6 that morning. He did not raise his hands. A journalist asked whether he planned to pursue legal action against Asterian Motors. He shook his head once. "I didn't bring this thing here to tear anyone down. For 15 years, they called the truth a failure. They used my face to do it. I just needed to give the truth a chance to say something for itself." In the first 3 trading days after the test, Asterian stock fell 17%. Vaughn Mercer tendered his resignation before a formal board removal vote could be scheduled. Sierra Calloway was placed on suspension pending a regulatory review. Whitney Boone published a series that ran over 8 months. It documented the financial architecture behind the 2009 decision, and a systemic pattern Asterian had used to push black engineers off promotion tracks. 6 weeks after the test, Sierra Calloway asked to meet Holden privately. She came alone on a Tuesday afternoon. The leaves had begun to turn. She told him that when the hold order went out, she had been 31. She had believed sincerely that protecting the company was the same as protecting the people in it. She had told herself the suppression of the RX-1 was a necessary sacrifice so many times with such consistency that it had almost become something that resembled truth. Then she said, "I knew whose name went in the file. I let it. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm telling you so you can hear me say it out loud." Holden listened. Then he said, "You didn't just bury a machine. You told the people who built it, Gideon, Dorian, me, that what we made wasn't worth defending. Then, you spent 15 years building a company on the story of our failure." Sierra sat with that. She said, very quietly, "I know." She did not stay long. Before she left, she looked at the RX-1 once more, with the soft attention of someone realizing the thing had always been the size it actually was. Multiple acquisition offers followed. Holden engaged with each on 3 non-negotiable conditions. Gideon Hart and Dorian Blake formally credited as founding engineers. All test data submitted to an independent audit body before licensing. Any entity commercializing the technology to establish a funded support program for technicians and engineers who lost work in 2009, with first-line eligibility going to the Black and minority employees pushed out by those documents. These conditions were honored. The following spring, the shop still bore the same painted metal sign on the same faded frame. Behind the main bay, through a door that hadn't existed a year earlier, was a new testing annex built from private grant funding. The annex bore no name. Gideon drove up from Dayton twice a month. Dorian Blake returned to active engineering work for the first time in 15 years. At the regional engineering conference that fall, the RX-1 was displayed exactly as it had arrived, road-worn, hand-repaired, the old Asterion logo leaning against the front tire. Maddie was in the audience that day. 3rd row, a notebook open in her lap. She was 15 now. A graduate student sitting nearby asked, quietly, if she was related to the Barrett from the RX-1 case. Maddie nodded. The student asked what it had been like to watch. Maddie thought about it for a moment. Then she said, he didn't fix it to prove anyone wrong. He fixed it because he didn't know how to walk away from something that still had something to say. That evening, after the conference was over, Holden drove the RX-1 out to the test road one last time. Not for a demonstration. The sun was going down behind the tree line, throwing long orange light across the flat ground. The turbine ran quietly. Gideon stood by the edge of the road. Whitney kept her camera low. Dorian listened to the engine from Montana. Holden completed the circuit and came to a stop where he had started. On the dashboard, where the original Asterion designation had been, the status line read what he had entered the night before. RX-1, alive. He turned the engine off. The turbine wound down. The cooling metal made small sounds in the dark. Holden sat still. He thought about the $900, the 47 nights, the 12 minutes that had stolen 15 years from people who had deserved better. Then he exhaled, long and slow, the breath of a man setting down a weight he had carried so long. It had become part of his posture.